Graham is the president of consulting and growth at Tolivity, where he leads the AI and talent tech consulting practice, helping organizations cut through technology hype to solve real operational problems. He has more than 15 years of experience in recruiting, marketing, and HR technology. He's also worked for Fortune 500 companies and high growth startups to elevate, implement, and optimize recruiting tech from ATS platforms to AI powered tools. Prior to Tolivity, Graham founded and sold ChangeState in 2024, which was a recruitment, marketing, and HR transformation consultancy known for its vendor agnostic, ROI focused approach that has saved clients millions by avoiding shelfware. So, with that, we'll turn it over to Graham.
Yeah, so super excited to be here. Great introduction. As Zach and Nick know, I actually started Change State with one of my best friends from high school. So I think you guys are definitely doing it right. So, a couple things I want to cover before we get started. So, what's the session about? The session isn't about tools. It's not about vendors. It's really about what AI reveals once it's pointed at your organization. We think that new advances in AI, like AI search, is really a forcing function for how AI is exposing culture problems within organizations. So, I'm intentionally not talking about how AI is going to transform hiring. I think that many of the failures with AI implementations aren't technical in nature; they're organizational. So, today we're going to talk a little bit more about what breaks before AI and before the tech really matters. I want to set the stage a little bit with what we see as the new reality. I'm going to crystallize this to an example about AI search. And so when we think about culture, we have to think about candidates. And, the new reality is that when candidates are asking AI search engines, maybe it's ChatGPT, maybe it's Claude, about your company, it doesn't cite your careers page. That means that candidates don't necessarily start on your career page anymore. And AI is summarizing what already exists. And so, if the answer feels off, AI isn't necessarily inventing it. Your culture is now visible and AI is making it searchable, summarizable, and scalable outside of your purview. And so I think of AI visibility as the new glass door. And so that means, a candidate might go out and ask ChatGPT, what's it like to work at Amazon? And Glassdoor used to be the scary part, and now AI search engines are aggregating all of this content from Glassdoor, from Reddit, from ex-employees. And, you don't really get to opt out of this conversation, right? And so, your story, your culture story is being told, often without, your input. And so, this is a real example. If you go out to ChatGPT and ask what it's like working at your company, you're going to find that the majority of domains cited and all the content is coming from third parties that are arguably variable quality sources. Maybe it's Indeed, Reddit. If you're a big organization like Amazon, it's probably driven by sites like Business Insider. And AI has fundamentally changed how your culture is visible to candidates. But that's not all we're going to talk about. Let me tell you a little bit more about why you should believe me. Zach gave a great introduction of who I am. I started my career a career builder, held every sales role from East to West Coast. And then I started our sales engineering and solutions architect group. So when we were buying and building software in the pre-hire space, it was our team that would stand in front of a metaphorical whiteboard, map out gaps in your tools, your processes, your advertising, and help you understand how you can improve your recruitment process as a whole. That led to founding Change State, my buddy Marty. My background very heavy in the HR tech side. Marty ran a consumer brand research company for 10 years with a professor at Berkeley, professor at Notre Dame. So, when we think about that moment of truth when candidates are deciding whether they want to apply for or work at an organization, we thought that, that consumer messaging framework was super important from a culture and marketing standpoint for attracting talent. Last year we sold Change State to Recruitix, and I moved into a role running consulting and growth at our sister organization, Tolivity. And that's where I spend my time today. in my free time, you see me hosting the Changing State of Talent Acquisition podcast. We have a lot of virtual coffees with talent acquisition leaders. All of that, forms our opinions too. We're 75 episodes into the podcast. We've had anyone from Rashad Tabakawala, who is the president of the Publicis Group, one of the largest media agencies on the globe. We've had the mayor of Miami Suarez, when he was rebranding Miami as Silicon Valley East. And boy, I thought that was such an interesting conversation or approach for a city to take the lead in building the culture of a city to attract startups and to attract companies. And I guess what I'd also say is I've been the person that has sold solutions earlier in my life. Change State were the people that were implementing the solutions, and now in our role of consulting and growth at Talivity, we're really the people that are fixing the issues that come to place when tech that we decided to purchase doesn't necessarily work. Now, I'll say the failures of implementing AI, of implementing new technology, are not accidents. I think they largely come from avoiding hard decisions, and AI and technology really removes the buffer that humans typically are providing. And so again, technology really fails because the technology wasn't working. It fails because culture really wasn't ready for what it would expose. So what does culture actually mean here? When we think about culture, we're thinking about it's not the perks, it's not the value posters in this context. I think about culture as the invisible infrastructure of how work happens. And, this infrastructure either supports change or it collapses underneath it. And so, think about, company culture as the building of a city. Above ground, at the street level, you have buildings, you have cars, and those are the company perks. Those are the core values. But that city doesn't function without the infrastructure that sits underneath the street level. And that might be, plumbing that's electric. It's a whole infrastructure that keeps that city moving. And so, that's really the way that we think about culture. There's the visible culture and there's everything that's happening underneath. And so, the invisible infrastructure of how work happens is how decisions are made or avoided. It's the standards and how they are defined or assumed, how ownership is assigned, and how feedback flows. And so, we've seen in our projects that most companies don't necessarily lack data. They lack the courage to define standards and how that data is being used. So, when we think about implementing AI, implementing new technology, we see one loop over and over, and we call that the AI failure loop. And so, it functions in 6 different steps. The first thing we see is an organization deploys AI to fix a problem. Then we move on, and this AI tool automates existing workflows. And we see that the workflows that are being automated were never clearly defined. So what AI does is it amplifies that inconsistency and the ambiguity that already exists in the culture and the foundation of that company. Teams then go blame the technology, and then a tool gets replaced, and many times nothing improves. And so, with our AI failure loop, the reality is that technology usually works, but the problem is, the culture or the underlying culture of an organization can't support our new tools. And so it's a loop that we see over and over again. We say AI does not introduce chaos. It really just accelerates the ambiguity for what already exists. And again, most organizations are replacing tools instead of fixing their decisions. So, what do culture problems look like in practice? I would say none of these are exotic problems, and many of these will probably feel normal inside your organizations. But the headline is, AI and technology is making him increasingly more difficult or impossible to ignore. And so, this slide kind of feels familiar. That's the point. So what do culture problems look like in practice? Again, these show up before AI. AI just forces visibility. These are decisions that are made by a committee, but owned by no one. It's collaboration that is just used to avoid conflict. So collaboration maybe when decisions have already been made. Standards that change depending on who's in the room. I think we've all been in meetings where let's just say our leaders have already decided that they have a different constituent that they're trying to appease. Maybe that's conversations with the hire managers. Maybe that's conversations with heads of marketing or executives. It's feedback that is too vague to act on, or this is my favorite processes that exist because that's always how we've done it. And so AI is exposing these culture gaps faster than anything else. So what do we mean by that? When we think about traditional change, humans can smooth things over, and AI and technology can't. So that means that anything that is vague, breaks immediately because AI is removing discretion, and with it, the stops or the human in the loop, which we've heard, so often in many webinars, I'm sure. So traditional change, humans can compensate. When someone is, walking through the hiring process and maybe we're waiting on a yes/no decision, humans have the ability to, pick up a pattern and adjust. Judgment can hide gaps in a defined process. Problems often surface slowly, and like to say, you can paper over dysfunction. With AI implementation, machines really require explicit rules. We have vague processes that can fail immediately, and we have problems that are surfacing in gaps, or surfacing in weeks, or surfacing in days. I'm sure at least someone on the call has probably implemented a chatbot and recognized that, boy, if we don't program a chatbot to answer a very specific question, that falls apart in the career site. It falls apart in the conversations with candidates. And so it is a little bit more difficult to paper over these gaps. And so I always say AI removes discretion and rivet denial. So I'm going to talk a little bit about a framework that we use when we are helping clients before any AI investment. And we focus on 3 questions that we want clients to answer, not hypothetically, but, honestly. So, if one breaks, you are at risk that a whole system is breaking. And again, these are, we consider them leadership questions, not just technology questions. And so, before any AI investment, any technology investment, any process investment, healthy organizations can typically answer, these 3 questions. So first, it's clarity. Do we agree on what good looks like? What problem we are trying to solve? The second is consistency. And when we're measuring, are we applying standards the same way? And, the third piece is ownership. Does someone own outcomes when things break? So again, these aren't AI questions. These are organizational health questions, questions that get to the root of the culture at an organization. So we think of a clarity test. We think of maybe we're evaluating candidates and we're looking at a candidate screening tool or an AI screening tool, which is probably one of the scariest ones around right now if you read the news. We can ask 3 questions. We ask 3 recruiters, what makes a candidate strong for this role? And let's ask that same question to 3 hiring managers. If you can't define a good candidate and what makes a candidate strong for a role, and the different answer comes from hiring managers, we don't have clarity, and that's going to make it very difficult for us to implement or choose or shortlist the right tools for candidate screening tools. Right? In healthy cultures, we have shared languages, documented criteria. What does make a candidate strong for this role? We have explicit trade-offs. In unhealthy cultures, it's that old adage, it when you see it. Everyone's worked with hiring managers and teams where you've gotten feedback on candidates, and the candidates are just not the right one. Unhealthy culture, right? At its core, unstated assumptions, different answers from everyone. We look for the consistency tests. So the consistency test is looking at actual decisions, not stated values. So these are patterns that reveal the standard within a healthy culture. And so, again, let's pull 5 recent no decisions on a candidate, right? Or 5 yes decisions on a candidate. Ask, why did we pass this candidate forward? Or why did we, pass this candidate through as a no, right? In healthy cultures, we have clear patterns. We have consistent grading criteria for candidates. We have decisions that trace back to standards. In unhealthy cultures, it's post hoc rationalizations. We have different standards for different hire managers. We have different standards for different geographies. The old not a culture fit. And so, AI and technology forces you to choose. It really forces you to codify your standards or encoded bias, right? And so, oftentimes you'll see this show up regionally by job groupings, by hire managers, by VPs, right? And the consistency test makes sure and gets amplified by AI because you have to create rules, and amplifies your process and moves things quicker. And then on the ownership test, it's when things break, who actually owns it? Because accountability without authority doesn't work. So when things go wrong, who owns a bad hire? Everyone will probably shake or twitch a little bit when we talk about a candidate experience. Who fixes a broken candidate experience? I'm sure we've all gotten emails forwarded over, talking about a candidate that may have been rejected by AI. And what do they do next? They're off on social channels, talking about your organization and the broken process. The issues with how you're using AI or automation, and who has the authority to change process. So healthy cultures, accountability, authority aligned. There are named owners for the problems that you're trying to solve. The buck stops here. Right? In unhealthy cultures, it's we all own it, which works to a point. But at the end of the day, for AI implementations, for new technology tools, it's named owners, it's accountability, and it is authority that has the ability to make change and make decisions. So AI is exposing leadership gaps faster than most org charts do because we see it in implementations. So what does this diagnostic, these 3 questions really reveal? We think that the organizations that perform well in our diagnostics, they implement change faster. They retain talent longer because everyone's working off of the same metaphorical playbook. They can make better decisions, and really adapt, under pressure. And so I would say this isn't, necessarily about AI readiness. So we think of AI as, really just a mirror, right? And, culture is what's reflected in that mirror. And any AI tools or technology tools that you are implementing, the more breaks, the more hurdles in that process is going to reflect some of the underlying behaviors within your organization, whether or not your culture is as healthy as you feel it is. So, what happens if you ignore what AI is exposing? So if you think back to, a second slide when we talked about, AI search engines, and going beyond Glassdoor, the reality is now, AI is answering questions that get written without your input. And all of that organizational inconsistency is public. And, without internal alignment, without a strong foundational culture for change, you spend money swapping tools instead of fixing causes. So, this is both, reputational, right? And it's an economic, issue as well. right? So, if we're ignoring what AI is exposing, those AI answers about your company, they're all going to be written by former and current employees, and not in a positive light. The internal inconsistency that gets surfaced in implementing new AI tools, becomes a version of public truth. You spend six figures replacing tools instead of fixing decisions. And then those organizational health problems, those culture issues, that kind of live below the surface that you've diagnosed, become recruiting visibility problems, on the web. So I'm going to go through, one of the pieces that, we use when we think about, poorly defined work. So I'm sure many of you have seen the coined term of work slop. There's a great, probably decade-old podcast from Hidden Brain about, BS jobs. And it's the jobs that you do that don't add much value and just do to keep people busy. And I think in the world of AI, the importance of defining work, defining your job, defining your task is going to be huge. So, poorly defined work, we see as a culture symptom. And so, that surface symptom, sort of reinforces some of these, organizational clarity questions that we, talked about earlier with AI implementations. So, that surface symptom is, poor documentation, is not the root problem. The root problem is that, work isn't defined, because the culture never demanded it to be. And so, that means that, we avoid conflicts. We have meetings to collaborate, but we don't really collaborate. Historical drift, speed is prioritized over clarity. Now it's always test new AI tools. It is, getting new tools in the funnel, without defining, what we want to change in our process. And then, tribal knowledge hoarding. So cultural choices, not necessarily, process gaps. So, when we work through with clients, we work through what we call our 5-question audit. I think this applies to any process, any technology process when you're evaluating new AI tools, when evaluating new technology in general, and just quite literally a really good, cultural benchmarking exercise that you can go through, for any process within your organization. And so, I'd say pick one process, and in our 5-question audit, we say answer these honestly. The first one is, can you draw every step in the process? Second is, where do humans decide things? Third is, what information drives those decisions? Fourth is, are you using standards or gut feel? And 5, who owns it when it breaks? And, if you can't answer it clearly, that's not a process problem. That's a culture problem. You haven't taken the time as an organization to do the work, to clearly define, particular processes to make things easy. And so, what does this look like in practice? When the audit exposes some culture gaps, I always use the phrase quite a bit: the further away from corporate, the less people follow the rules. And this is just an example of a nationwide fast food chain that we ran a 5-question audit on their candidate experience. And so this was in relation to a client that was implemented or had implemented an AI scheduling tool across all of their locations. And so, the first piece is, can you draw every step, right? And the answer is no. Every store, every GM had a slightly different hiring workflow and timelines. And so no standardized process. And so, that meant because there was time open on someone's calendar, that didn't necessarily mean that, they were available, for interviewing people for, a front of shop cashier at a restaurant. Just because the lunch hour was open, and someone didn't block off their calendar at one location, it was not necessarily meant it was free. Where do humans decide things? Store managers making a lot of gut calls on hires, often done outside of an ATS. And we had common interviews, but decisions were driven by openings, not by set metrics for whether someone was a fit or not. So what information drives decisions? Can they start Monday? Would they pass a drug test? Not necessarily, a rubric that we want to automate when we're hiring at scale. Standards are gut feel. We've gone through that ad nauseum. Then who owns it when it breaks, right? Nobody. High turnover is normal in the industry. That makes it difficult for there to be accountability. So again, like, and implementing an AI scheduling tool, it didn't really cause chaos. Kind of revealed what was already chaotic in place. So, what changed before technology? We had to change culturally first, and this means, regional leaders had to create more of a standard hiring workflow, across all stores. We had to build consistent interview structures, not only same questions, but boy, it couldn't be a cattle call in one location and scheduled interviews 15 miles over or 15 minutes over. You more clearly define qualified and reliable for interviewees to make sure that we had specific measurable criteria, during that interview process when we were qualifying people for interviews. And then, we assigned GMs to really own turnover metrics and hiring quality. So only then does it make sense to explore and roll out AI interviewing, scheduling, and screening across the organization. And so, the technology works because standards are put into place. The culture of the organization is shifted, not because we implemented an AI scheduling tool. The change and shift in culture first that allowed AI scheduling and screening to be successful. So, the foundation first roadmap, you'll notice X, Y, and Z. All of these date ranges are purely, customizable and configurable for organizations. But, when we think about a foundation first roadmap, we really think of it in three phases. The first phase is always going to be diagnostic, right? And so, I think one of the things that we do most poorly in talent acquisition is, focus on, diagnosing a problem and recognizing what problem we're trying to solve before we jump to deploying technology. And so, we challenge you all, run a 5-question audit on one of your critical processes. Read your public reviews, actually read them, and your ESAT surveys, and I think you'll get a lot of culture gaps surfaced, through that process. Because again, AI and technology is really more of a mirror. This data exists out there. And so after you figure out what you're trying to change, what problem you're trying to solve, you got to fix your culture, right? So if it's a screening tool, right? If it's a scheduling tool, work through the process of defining what good actually looks like. Documented good candidates. Documented right process. And let's not make assumptions. Assign named owners. Not just committees. And then leadership models. Should be standard and visible to all. And then the third step is where you deploy new technology, where you pilot AI when your culture is ready. Expand based on readiness, not vendor pressure. And then measure culture health alongside AI performance. You'll see it in your reviews. You'll see it in your publicly available data. You'll see it in your ESAT surveys. Because your own employees are testing AI tools and testing solutions with whether you're along for the ride or not. And so again, you have a real good ability to measure your cultural health alongside AI implementations and performance. So I would just say the final question is really AI isn't really asking if your culture is ready. It's happening behind the scenes. It's happening publicly, regardless. So I just say, can 3 people define what good work is for a role in the same way? When things break, does someone own the outcome? Are standards explicit? Are they political? And then, as a whole, is AI amplifying clarity or exposing, avoidance? Because again, our big belief is, we don't think AI is a silver bullet to fix your culture, but it is going to show you, what leadership has chosen, not to fix. So that's where I'll pause, and I think by design we've got time for questions, Zach.
Awesome. Thanks, Graham. I know AI is a hot topic everywhere, but I love how this kind of affects or our community and how we think about culture. I'm just curious, and for the audience, feel free to throw your questions in the chat. We can get those answered. Um, but just as I'm listening to this presentation, do you have any like clients or customers like stories where they try to implement AI to help with culture and it just fails? Like what are they doing wrong and what kind of things are like the top things that people should avoid?
Yeah, so I think the hottest thing that we're talking about and hearing from clients right now is AI search, right? And so that is probably the biggest fear mongering that's going on in our industry now. And um, there's a lot of vendors out there that are talking about getting your jobs in AI search, engines. They're talking about like getting, getting cited in AI search engines. And, I'd say like, that is probably one of the biggest places where I would challenge organizations to, do their diagnostic work, first. There's a lot of structural issues with websites that matter. Schema, AI search engines are not necessarily making it very easy to understand how you get your data there. And I would also say, like, that is also probably one of the areas where, if you zoom out, 5 years when, programmatic job boards and job aggregators kind of blew up, one of the things that they, are selling is get our jobs on Google for jobs. And, it's a very scammy experience. We're starting to see that play out in AI search engines too. So like, I would say that is, when we think about where people are using AI, like I would say one of the first places that I would challenge people to kind of start thinking about it is, how can you protect your own real estate from, the bad behaviors that are, or bad players that are increasingly good at telling your story for you across AI search. Yeah.
Mm, yeah, yeah, I like that. And when you like when you think about it and zoom out like 5 years from now, what are like some of the top things you think AI will be handling that maybe people aren't thinking about right now?
Yeah, well, there's a HBR put out, their whole focus on work slop, in Q4, right? And so like work slop is, poorly defined tasks that, people use AI for and get outputs that are quite simply sloppy, right? And
Mhm.
so, I think that's probably, the best sort of, guardrails that we could think about of how people are going to use AI in the future. I think that we're going to move a lot further away from jobs, and we're going to move much more towards what are the tasks that the very specific tasks that make up a job, right? And so the last decade we heard a lot about skills based hiring. I think we're going to move to much more of a fractional task based world, and so that
Mm.
means, you're going to hire people that, you know, anything that's administrative, that's scalable, that's clearly repeatable, is going to be where AI does take over, and we'll feel comfortable with that. The anything that is, requires judgment, true judgment, is where humans are going to stay, in, the actual funnel itself. And so, like, I think of it as, like, if it's repeatable tasks, that is where we're going to see, a lot more fractional work that, comes in. And I think, the biggest skill that people are going to need to have, in 2, 3, 5 years from now, it's going to be, the ability to critically think, because whether we admit it or not, like AI gets a lot of things wrong. And, there's Deloitte in the fall got sued in Australia. They used AI to write a research paper and for the Australian government, and half of the sources were made up cases, and they lost $500,000, in that lawsuit. And so, like, I think critically thinking is going to be a huge skill of the future. I think being able to recognize that, boy, like, are we checking the work? Are we confident that what we're saying is factual? Is probably going to be the biggest thing across the board. So.
Super interesting. Yeah, I heard someone say at a talk once, it was like in 5 years, 80% of your skills are going to be kind of worthless or replaced by AI, but the 20% that isn't, which is kind of like what you're talking about, the critical thinking, the human stuff, are going to be like exponentially more valuable. So found that really
Yeah.
interesting.
Well, I'd say like, one of my biggest pet peeves is you hear people talking about the skills of the future. AI is not a skill, right? Like AI is a tool, and
Yeah.
and that I think that's the biggest piece. People grab it like, you get people to a webinar because you put AI. You get, you think that you need to have, whatever you're doing has to say AI on it. But even our consulting projects, where sure, like we want to use AI, in a lot of the things that we're doing, but really like it's strategic consulting, it's process, design, it's AI is a buzzword still, and I think the future world, it's going to be owned by the strategic thinkers. I think it's going to be and then I think the challenge is going to be you know the people that perform best in the new world are going to be people who recognize that some of the things that you did for the last 10 years are not important, and it's okay to let some of those things go. I think
Right.
it's going to be really hard in our industry in particular. People are not going to want to let go of tasks that they've done for the last decade. And
Yep.
I saw a post the other weekend. um, learning and development is going to be key. If you're not curious, if you don't want to learn, that's going to be a problem in the future. But equally important is unlearning, right? And it's being able to say, you know what, I don't do that anymore, right? And that's not something that like I need to be investing my time on too.
Right. Totally. Super interesting. Well, if you have questions, throw them in the chat. Looks like we have one here from Jeffrey, who asked, how do you measure AI readiness and what are the standards you would use in a client engagement?
Yeah, so there's a lot of different ways that we look at it, Jeffrey, in our practice, right? So we have a different rubric, or scorecard that we'll call it when we're talking about implementing a new technology. And so maybe it's implementing a new candidate screening tool, maybe it's interviewing an AI interviewing tool, and a lot of that goes to how we identify or measure good, right? Can you define, how you want to screen candidates out? Can we define like what roles are going to move into, a video interviewing tool and so on? So, it's a whole rubric. I'm happy to share that kind of offline, Jeffrey, too, and give you a peek behind the curtain. I'd say, that AI readiness, is very different if we're talking about optimizing a site for, search, right? And that's just, content availability, right? It's, schema and structure. And so, readiness for optimizing your site depends on content. It depends on a lot of the employer brand type work being publicly available and visible. And what you're doing when we talk about implementing new AI tools and technology, depends a lot more on specific definitions on how we move a candidate through a process, how we would schedule a candidate for an interview, how we would go out and source for new candidates today, and things that we're willing to, we would say, flex on, right, when it comes to risk in implementing AI and injecting AIs in certain parts of the process.
Awesome. Well, I think that's the only question I see in the chat right now, but thank you to everyone for joining us. Feel free to scan that QR code to learn more about Tolivity and connect with Graham on LinkedIn. And Graham, thank you again for leading the webinar this month. Really appreciate it.